I'm sure you've probably heard it 1,000 times before, that sugar is essentially the primary fuel for your entire body, right? And it's often said that without a steady supply of glucose, your brain would simply start to shut down completely. Well, listen closely to what I'm about to tell you because it turns out you've only been told half the story. And it turns out the missing half is that's the part that's actually making you exhausted and causing even more problems. Sugar is not fuel. In reality, sugar acts in your cells exactly the same way acid does in a battery. If you go overboard, it corrodes them. Well, if you've ever felt that, an hour after eating, your brain turns to molasses. Or if you feel that no matter how much water you drink, your skin stays dry and your eyes feel tired, that's not because you're lacking energy. It's basically that your internal battery is melting, literally. In this video, we're going to go over the biophysics that your doctor has most likely never explained to you. And we're going to see how sugar dissolves the crystal of your life. And above all, and most importantly, we're going to analyze how to put high-tech armor on that crystal, which is your internal environment, so you can shine again without blowing your fuses. Well then, I would like to warmly welcome you to the fascinating engineering of cellular armor. In the previous videos, I gave you the manual of the 6 families of foods. You learned how to clean the swamp with celery, seal the cracks with chia, and produce metabolic water with pomegranate, among many other fruits and vegetables. And with that, basically what you have, as I was saying, is the software of high fidelity. But now the engineering problem arises. It is completely and utterly pointless to have the most advanced and sophisticated operating system in the world if you accidentally permit a corrosive liquid solvent to seep deep into the hardware and eventually dissolve the components into a useless soup. To understand sugar, we first have to understand what we are. And for this, there's nothing better than starting with what we are not. And we are not sacks of chemical reactions. This is very important to understand. We are liquid crystals. And in engineering, a liquid crystal is essentially a unique and fascinating state of matter that seamlessly integrates the structural order of a solid with the dynamic fluidity of a liquid. And that is precisely the characteristic of what we call structured water, H3O2, as it exists inside your cells. It is not just loose or random water. It is a highly sophisticated and perfectly organized molecular network, held together firmly by a complex web of hydrogen bonds. This network is your fiber optic system, and it's what allows an electrical signal to travel from your eye to your brain in milliseconds. If the water is ordered, the signal flies. And if the water is disordered, the signal simply gets lost. Well, this is exactly where sugar comes in. And this is also where most nutritionists only really scratch the surface. You see, in biophysics, we classify substances into 2 groups. On one side, there are the cosmotropes or order creators, and on the other, there are the chaotropes or chaos creators. The glucose molecule has a physical characteristic that is and makes it lethal. It bristles with hydroxyl groups, and these groups are real vacuums for hydrogen. And what happens when sugar floods your blood and your cells? Well, what happens is that glucose, which has a much greater affinity for water than your proteins or your DNA, causes disorder. And what does that mean? It means that sugar starts to steal the hydrogen bonds, which kept your water structured in a crystalline form. Because To help you understand with an example, this is very similar to what happens in winter when there's snow on the roads and we spread salt to remove the ice from the snow. The salt doesn't heat the ice. What salt basically does is physically break the crystalline structure of the ice, and it forces it to become liquid water at certain temperatures. At temperatures where, however, it should remain solid. Well, this is exactly what sugar does to the internal molecular arrangement of your structured water. Simple sugar is the essential salt of your biological cells. And when you consume too much sugar, you're not gaining energy. What you're basically doing is starting a process that melts your infrastructure, and it's as harsh as it sounds. That the presence of sugar causes the liquid crystal in your exclusion zone and so on to simply and completely collapse. Your organized water turns back into chaotic H2O, and at that very moment your electrical conductivity disappears. You see, the second law of thermodynamics tells us that the universe tends toward disorder, what is called entropy, and staying alive is essentially fighting against entropy, and being healthy is maintaining molecular order. Well, it turns out that sugar is a massive injection of entropy into your body. By breaking the hydrogen bonds, sugar increases the random movement of water molecules, and without you realizing it, what happens is that you go from a high-speed communication system to molecular white noise. And that is exactly why you are feeling tired. It's not just because of a sugar crash, although that's part of it too. It's that your cells have lost the ability to transmit information. The hardware actually becomes wet and a bit more disorganized. And your brain in that state tries to think as if it is working through a puddle of dirty water instead of a liquid crystal quartz. As you can probably imagine for yourself, if you are unable to find a way to stop this internal melting process from occurring, all of the beneficial boron that you might get from eating a pear, or even the healthy electrons that you obtain from drinking matcha tea, will not be able to do you any good at all, because the reality is that you will simply be attempting to charge up a battery whose internal compartments and structures have quite simply dissolved away into nothing. And to really understand why sugar is so incredibly destructive, you have to first understand a key concept from the field of materials engineering, which is called cooperativity. In structured water, H3O2, the hydrogen bonds are not isolated links. They're like a choir, and when one bond forms, it strengthens the one next to it. And this ends up creating a network of clusters that act as a single unit. And this is what allows the water in your cells to have memory and coherence. However, as you can clearly see here, the glucose molecule itself acts as a significant phase disruptor. And because this sugar possesses so many different hydroxyl groups, what it essentially ends up doing is effectively disguising itself as a water molecule. But it comes along with a major problem. It simply doesn't know how to sing in harmony with the rest of the choir. What it's actually doing is sabotaging you, because sugar, it attracts water molecules to itself and forms what we call a solvation sphere. And you might ask, what is the consequence? Well, it is actually quite a straightforward process. Around every individual molecule of sugar, the water stops being cooperative and instead becomes entirely selfish. This sugar effectively hijacks the attention of the hydrogens, and it completely breaks the continuous chain reaction domino effect that previously maintained the gel of your cytoplasm OH3O2. From a strictly engineering perspective, you are essentially transitioning from being a highly organized and integrated crystalline structure into what is known as a suspension of isolated particles. And once this process occurs, you will inevitably lose your structural integrity. The structural integrity of the fluid. And here we get into the depth that separates an ordinary science communicator from a chief engineer. Let's analyze how energy moves in your body, and this is important to understand. It doesn't move by slow diffusion. It moves through what is called the Grott's mechanism. In perfectly structured water, H+ protons don't swim. What they do is jump. It's a quantum tunneling effect where a proton enters one side of the hydrogen network and almost instantly another comes out the other end. To help you understand this with a simple example, it's like a line of people passing a bucket of water. The bucket doesn't have to travel the whole distance. All it does is go from hand to hand. So then what does sugar do in that tunnel? Sugar acts like an insulator right in the middle of a copper wire, blocking the flow of electricity through that part. It breaks the network of hydrogen bonds and forms its own solvation spheres. In other words, sugar creates walls that prevent the protons from jumping, and this specific phenomenon, in the final analysis, essentially means that the overall efficiency of your proton conductivity will simply begin to plummet quite dramatically under these conditions. And this is precisely the reason why, whenever you experience these sudden spikes in your blood glucose levels, you might find that your cognitive thinking becomes significantly slower. This is not simply a matter of willpower or discipline. Physically speaking, what you have actually done is increase the electrical impedance of your internal neural circuits. You are currently attempting to transmit a high-frequency 5G wireless signal through a physical transmission cable that sugar has effectively transformed into a piece of solid plastic. If we remember Dr. Gerald Pollack, the Exclusion Zone AZ is a battery that charges with infrared light. But for that battery to function effectively, the water must be in a highly structured and dense hexagonal molecular formation. And sugar is physically, as I was saying, an essential agent in this process. It is a measure of disorder, that is to say, of entropy. The presence of this entropy increases the total volume of liquid water, H2O, and simultaneously decreases the volume of hexagonal water, H3O2. And when the exclusion zone is reduced, what happens is that there is less space to separate charges, and this means less EZ, less charge. And although it may appear to be somewhat counterintuitive, by disrupting the structural integrity of the liquid crystal, the medium becomes significantly more thick, viscous, and notably more adhesive. This is somewhat like the basic principle of thick syrup being applied directly to your blood and your surrounding interstitial fluid. Put simply, the viscosity increases. And you, fiber optics? It has simply turned into a swamp of molasses. As you can imagine, what is the energy cost to move a single signal through that swamp? That's what leaves you feeling completely exhausted, both physically and mentally, after enjoying a dessert or a meal that is particularly high in refined carbohydrates. In order for your cathedral to function, each of your 30 trillion cells must act as a capacitor. And in electrical engineering, as you well know, a capacitor is basically a device that stores energy by separating positive charges from negative charges using an insulating material. In your body, that capacitor is the cell membrane, and the material that allows the charge to be maintained is structured water, H3O2. When you are in a state of optimal health, the internal environment of your cell maintains a massive negative electrical charge compared to the fluid on the outside. But that specific voltage differential, thank you very much for your attention. That is what we call the resting membrane potential. An elite athlete or a vibrant person typically operates between minus 70 millivolts or even minus 90 millivolts. And that voltage is not a byproduct of life, that voltage is life itself. As we have also discussed in previous videos, it is the pressure, the electrical pressure necessary for nutrients to enter, waste to exit, and for your DNA to be properly expressed. Well, this is exactly where sugar sabotage, once again, truly becomes a critical factor to consider. For a capacitor to store charge, it needs an insulator with a certain permittivity, a specific dielectric. The molecular structure of structured water already possesses an exceptionally high level of permittivity. It serves as a remarkably ideal and stable medium for the electric field. And here you'll have to forgive me because I need to pause for a moment to explain a couple of concepts. In electrical engineering, the power of a capacitor doesn't just depend on the size of its plates, but also on the quality of the material between them. That material is basically called the dielectric. And to help you understand, the dielectric is like the holder of the electric field. Its function basically is to allow the charges, positive and negative charges, face each other with enormous tension, but they never touch. If they touched, a short circuit would occur and the energy would dissipate as heat. And this is where dielectric permittivity comes in. What is it? You might ask me. To put it simply, it is the measurement of how much a material allows an internal electric field to be established within it when subjected to an external voltage. The higher the level of the permittivity, the greater the capacitor's inherent capacity to store electrical charge within that same physical space. Structured water, H3O2, unlike tap water, H2O. What is it? As I've already told you, it's a disordered and chaotic soup. H3O2 is a liquid crystal. That is to say, it's a super insulator. And that's because of its hexagonal organization. It is important to note that structured water possesses an exceptionally high level of dielectric permittivity. This characteristic means that it functions as a very high-fidelity support system for the surrounding electric field. This is what allows the cell membrane to sustain a voltage of minus 70 millivolts and higher over a distance of just a few nanometers. In other words, and so you understand, it's the perfect support. But when sugar comes into play, it acts as a solvent that reduces, that permittivity. When the surface of the water is disturbed, the insulating material becomes faulty, the relative permittivity begins to drop, and the total accumulated charge leaks away. It's even worse because without the network of hydrogen bonds to keep the charges separated, the positive protons and negative electrons start to mix. And what does that mean? Short circuit. But it is not just any short circuit. Specifically, it is actually a molecular short circuit. Essentially, the internal battery of your individual cells starts to slowly lose its charge through the cellular walls. It is not necessarily that you are lacking the required fuel. It is simply that the storage tank has developed numerous electrical holes, causing your vital energy to dissipate as completely useless heat. instead of being efficiently used for essential biological work. When excess sugar molecules begin to sabotage your delicate hydrogen bond network, the electrical voltage starts to drop significantly. And here we enter a profound scale of degeneration that conventional medicine is unfortunately rarely equipped to measure or track. You see, between minus 70 millivolts and minus 90 millivolts, you are in a state of biological sovereignty, in a state of total regeneration, clear thinking, and active DNA repair. At minus 50 millivolts, you are in a survival state. You start to feel chronic fatigue, and the body begins to prioritize basic functions, and in some cases it simply turns off the lights in the brain, which is what you know as brain fog. And at minus 20 millivolts, you are in a state of maximum entropy, and this is the documented voltage found in cancerous cells and necrotic tissues. A cell at minus 20 millivolts basically loses its electrical compass and no longer knows what it is or what it should do. It's like a cell that has entered bioelectric amnesia. And the main culprit for this descent into electrical hell is the constant consumption of glucose without any shield to maintain it, leaving your batteries in a state of permanent discharge. You see, to maintain voltage, the cell has a motor, the sodium-potassium pump, and this motor consumes 25% of all your ATP energy. Its main function is to pump sodium out and bring potassium in, to maintain the gradient. And what does sugar do here? Sugar not only breaks the water crystal, it also blocks ATP production in the mitochondria because it generates an excess of free radicals. This is what we call the toxic smoke I already told you about in the previous video. And it's very simple. Without ATP energy, the pump's motor stops. Without the functioning of this motor, sodium ions begin to accumulate rapidly inside the cell. And as that sodium builds up within the interior, the electrical voltage across the membrane starts to drop even faster than before. Within the field of engineering, this scenario is referred to as a cascade failure. Consuming refined sugar effectively shuts down the ATP power supply, and at the same time, it completely compromises the H3O2 structural wiring system. If you find yourself in a situation like this, basically what you're doing is trying to start an engine with melted wires and no fuel. One of the most serious and at the same time most obvious consequences of this is reflected in the brain. The brain is the organ with the highest electrical demand, and your thoughts are patterns of voltage. When sugar melts the liquid crystal of your neurons, the signal no longer travels through the proton tunnel I explained earlier. The signal simply disperses into nothingness. Imagine trying to listen to a grand, complex symphony on an old radio plagued with massive, overwhelming interference. The beautiful symphony is still playing there, but all you can actually hear is a wall of harsh, unrelenting static. And that static is what you experience as mental fog. Your brain is expending a Herculean amount of energy because it's trying to clean up a signal that sugar is physically dirtying. Sugar steals your cognitive bandwidth, and so that your cathedral doesn't get flooded, thank you, and maintains its electrical structure. Basically, what you need is a constant bilge pump. And that pump is the sodium-potassium pump. It is, without a doubt, a complex protein that crosses the cell membrane, and its sole mission is to fight against entropy. And what is it? The logistics of voltage, as I have frequently mentioned in several of my other videos, this specialized sodium-potassium pump deliberately carries out a highly unequal exchange of ions. Specifically, it actively pumps 3 sodium ions out of the cell and simultaneously brings 2 potassium ions back inside. Since you expel more positive charges than you bring into the cell, it basically becomes more negative inside. It's a very simple mathematical engineering operation. 3 minus 2 equals a net of 1. And this cycle is carried out thousands of times per second. And thanks to this imbalance that is forcibly maintained, you generate that energy buffer of minus 70 millivolts. In other words, this pump is so critical that it consumes approximately 25% of all the ATP energy produced. And this is happening right now while you're watching this video. And you'll see if you're a neuron, it turns out that this expenditure rises to as much as 70%. Just to show you exactly how vital and important it is, your body will often choose to shut down other non-essential systems before ever letting this pump stop, because if the pump stops, the cell quickly equalizes with the environment outside, loses its unique identity, and eventually dies. And this is where sugar goes from being a weight problem to becoming a true mechanical sabotage. To help you understand better, sugar attacks the sodium-potassium pump from 3 energy fronts. The first is glycation or mechanical caramelization. When there is an excess amount of glucose in the bloodstream, it reacts with the essential proteins of the pump in a chemical process commonly known as glycation. Think of it like this. If you were to take thick, molten liquid caramel and poured it directly into the heart of a high-precision engine, what exactly do you imagine would happen next? The parts would start to stick together. Well, that's exactly what happens with excess glucose. The pump loses flexibility and can no longer pivot to exchange ions. The engine, due to pure molecular friction, slows down. The second front it attacks is magnesium sequestration. As it turns out, the sodium-potassium pump is not just a simple protein. It is a specialized enzyme that requires a specific ignition to work, and that ignition is triggered by magnesium. Without magnesium, it doesn't ignite, and ATP simply can't release its energy to move the pump. It turns out that sugar metabolism consumes industrial amounts of magnesium. For every molecule of glucose you process, you burn through your magnesium reserves. To put it simply, whenever you consume high amounts of glucose, you are actually encouraging a form of internal sabotage that takes place deep within your own body. And what is the result? You're leaving your own engine without spark plugs. You have the ATP fuel, but you don't have the spark to ignite it, i.e. magnesium. And then there's the third flank, the smoke, mitochondrial. As I mentioned before, processing sugar is basically dirty combustion. It generates free radicals that directly attack the lipids of the membrane where the pump is anchored. And what does this cause? Well, it's very simple. If the engine mount falls apart, the engine falls down. The pump loses its anchor and stops operating with any real efficiency. And what is the consequence? Well, basically, it allows sodium to leak back in by simple diffusion. Whenever excess sugar begins to jam the cellular pump mechanism, sodium starts to accumulate within the system. Inside your cell and in biophysics, where sodium goes, water follows. That is, the cell actually begins to slowly suck in water in order to try to dilute that internal sodium, and as a result, it swells up, much like a balloon. A swollen cell has its organelles separated, its hydrogen bonds stretched, and its voltage at rock bottom. And you might ask me, what are the organelles of the cell? To put it in very simple terms, these organelles function essentially like the internal organs of your individual cells. Just as your body and mind rely on organs like the lungs, the heart, and the kidneys to function properly, every single one of your cells and mind contains its own specialized components that are designed to carry out all the necessary dirty work to keep things running smoothly. Think of the cell as if it were a high-precision factory. Well, the organelles are the individual machines on the assembly line, the mitochondria is the boiler, the nucleus is the blueprint office, and the DNA and ribosomes are the 3D printers. And the cytoplasm or structured water is basically the floor of the factory where all these machines are anchored. When I explain to you that the internal organelles begin to separate and the entire cell structure swells up just like a massive balloon, you must realize that this represents a complete and total logistical disaster for the organism. And it's a logistical disaster in 3 phases. The first is because there is a loss of communication. When the cell swells due to the sodium that draws in water, the machines simply move apart, and the result is that the internal logistics simply break down. The second is that there is a stretching of bridges, and as it's very simple, as the distance between the components increases, the hydrogen bonds stretch and stretch so much that they break. To put it in a completely different way, the electrical signal no longer has a quick, straightforward, and highly efficient path. Now it has to navigate its way across a vast and expansive ocean of liquid water, which is also disorganized. And the third, which is a consequence, is that there is a drop in efficiency. This is like if, on an assembly line, you had to run 50 meters to carry a screw from one machine to another. The energy expenditure goes up, production stops, and in the end the machines come to a halt. At this point, what you have is an inoperative factory, flooded and on the verge of electrical collapse. But you see, as it actually turns out, that is not quite all there is to it. What I'm about to tell you now is what should really worry you. The sabotage caused by sugar doesn't stop. Inside your cells. And I certainly understand that what I just shared with you today might sound very much like a terrifying horror movie for your biology. We have seen how sugar, that insidious and silent killer, isn't a healthy source of fuel, but is actually a powerful solvent that essentially causes our cellular structures to melt away. Your liquid crystal and turns your fiber optics into a swamp of molasses. We've also seen how it causes a short circuit in your cells to the point of lowering your voltage from a level of sovereignty to a mere level of survival. And we've also seen how it seizes up the engine of your sodium-potassium pump and leaves you without energy and with your cells swollen like balloons about to burst. Well, at this point, it's normal for you to think or to want to ask me, Jose Maria, is there still time to save my infrastructure, or are my cables simply already fried? And this is where I want to be very clear with you and lower the tension a bit. If you stop to think about it, your body and mind are the most remarkably complex, incredible, and resiliently designed pieces of engineering that currently exist in the world. It is a truly sophisticated and self-programmable biological organism. And that is exactly how you should always strive to perceive, understand, and interpret its function. And I am not telling you this just to scare you or make you feel uneasy. I am telling you this so that you will stop fighting against ghosts, and so you can finally truly understand the real reason why you feel so tired and worn out. Your fatigue isn't laziness, nor is it a lack of willpower. It's pure and simple material physics. And the good news is that just as an engineer can clean an engine and coat a cable, you can rebuild your own armor. As it happens, your cathedral has an extraordinary regenerative capacity that would truly amaze you if you simply give it the right materials it needs. But before I can finally provide you with these essential reconstruction tools, we first really need to deeply understand the very last hidden trap of sugar. Because sugar's sabotage doesn't just stay inside the cell. There is a much higher level of chaos that decides to hijack the water from your entire biological city. In the next video, we're going to see something that will blow your mind. It's called osmotic tyranny. Today, I'm going to carefully explain exactly why it is entirely possible for you to feel incredibly bloated, heavy, and as if you are retaining excess fluids on the outside, while at the very same time, your individual cells are literally dying of thirst on the deep inside. It is quite simply the great and confusing paradox of our modern struggle with dehydration. But you see, that won't be the most important thing in the next video. The most important thing is that we'll go on the offensive. I will provide you with the technical blueprints for the dielectric shielding systems. Today, we're going to explore the essential methods of utilizing premium high-fidelity healthy fats so that you can effectively construct a truly impenetrable bunker within your cellular membranes. We are going to guarantee and ensure that the next time sugar tries to get in, it encounters and is stopped by a formidable, impenetrable wall of advanced engineering that it simply cannot break through. Don't miss the second part, because that's where we stop analyzing the disaster, which we do need to analyze and understand, and start truly reclaiming your sovereignty, biological sovereignty over sugar. I'll be waiting for you there so that together we can build that shield. And if you like this video and think it could be useful to others, you would be doing me a big favor by sharing it, because that way you help me spread knowledge. As I always tell you, go forward, always forward, and I'll read your comments